Erik Princes is accused of violating an arms embargo to send weapons to a Libyan warlord. Did the Blackwater founder try to help Khalifa Haftar overthrow the UN-backed government? And if so, who paid for the privately funded military mission, and why did it fail? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Erik Princes' Project Opus. Now, a confidential United Nations report widely quoted in U.S. media has exposed a botched private military operation in eastern Libya. Chock full of code names, cover stories, and offshore bank accounts, it outlines an $80 million mission involving mercenaries, illicit weapons, and an attempt to overthrow the government. The 121-page report identified Blackwater founder Erik Princes as the contractor who proposed the operation to warlord Khalifa Haftar in Cairo back in April of 2019. Now, it describes Project Opus as a well-funded plan to provide Khalifa Haftar with a team of 20 foreign mercenaries, armed assault helicopters, drones, gunboats, and cyber warfare capabilities. Now, the report also mentions that Project Opus included a component to kidnap or terminate individuals regarded as high-value government targets in Libya. Erik Princes has denied any role in the operation. Now, our producers, of course, reached out to Erik Princes, his lawyer, and several associates to participate in our Newsmakers panel. However, we received no response. Fortunately, though, we do have, from Washington, Jonathan Weiner, former U.S. Special Envoy for Libya, and from here in Istanbul, Anas Al-Gomati, founder and director of Libya's Sadeq Institute. Thanks both so much for joining us. Jonathan, I'll start with you. Were you shocked by this UN report, or did you guess something like that could be happening?
Well, I was not entirely shocked. I was somewhat shocked that there could be Americans involved in this kind of operation. There have been lots of violations of the UN arms embargo for years now, and Khalifa Haftar has been involved in those violations and working with foreign governments, and he was trying to become dictator of all Libya. So would he want this kind of capability? Sure. That there might be an American involved in providing it to him, that's disturbing.
Anas, let me ask you, how has the participation of private companies, because we know of the Wagner Group already and now allegedly Erik Princes' organization, how has it perpetuated the war in your country? For example, do you think Haftar would have even been defeated by now?
Well, I certainly think that they've been able to give him a strategic advantage in ways in which he could have never imagined when he first launched and sparked Libya's first civil war in 2014. And I think that's where we need to start picking up the story. Erik Princes' involvement in Libya dates back allegedly, and I will use that word allegedly, to reports that were, reports as early as 2016, 17. Online War is Boring, for example, showed that he had been delivering air tractors, repurposed, essentially civilian aircraft, that were then used for Haftar's first war in Benghazi in the east of the country, and essentially also became a hangar. This area called Al-Khadim in eastern Libya became a hangar for the United Arab Emirates to also deliver Chinese drones called Wing Loons. They're mimics of the Predator drone, the US Predator drone. And so essentially that, Erik Princes' involvement goes back to then. There are also allegations that Erik Princes was involved in Khalifa Haftar's first emergence in the post-revolution Libyan environment in 2014, when he appeared in Tripoli and then disappeared. And there are those that have made similar allegations that Erik Princes may have shipped him out to Malta in 2014. So there are many, many allegations, but Erik Princes' fingerprints have been all over this since at least 2014, maybe 2017 if we give it a stretch. So I wasn't shocked by any of this, but the capabilities that he's given him, are a dream. And where he doesn't find it with the US or US contractors like Erik Princes, he turns to, the even darker and shadier version, the Wagner Group.
So you weren't shocked on us, but are you frustrated it's only being exposed now?
Yeah, this UN panel of expert reports, it's still not being disclosed fully. It's a black box of all of the aspects that we thought we knew, but we hadn't been able to prove thus far. And I think in that sense, yes, it's frustrating because not only could this have been completely avoided, but there are many aspects to this that are deeply political. Who else knew about Erik Princes' plan at the time? Had this affected, for example, Donald Trump's decision-making around the turn of April 4th, when he started to receive a number of phone calls, including from President Sisi in Egypt, where we know, or we at least understand, according to the reports, that Erik Princes had been meeting with Khalifa Haftar in Egypt. We also know that the foreign ministry in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates had also made similar calls around that time to turn Trump's head. So do we know that Trump was involved, or at least aware and conscious of the fact that American military personnel and individuals like Erik Princes were involved in this? If that is the case, then it gives you an idea of why for over 18 months there was absolutely no diplomatic response. And that begins with the very moment that the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, steps foot in Tripoli on April 4th to announce a UN reconciliation conference and is met with gunfire and the sound of explosions by Khalifa Haftar. He leaves within 24 hours saying, "I'm with the Libyan people no matter what happens," but fails to mention even Khalifa Haftar's name. So for Libyans, when you think of the last decade, what began in 2011, in March 2011, with UN Resolution 1973, which was the responsibility to protect civilian lives in Libya, a decade later, to see it done in such a way, to see high-profile American citizens like Erik Princes being involved in other states that had once come to the savior or the saving of Libyan civilian lives in eastern Libya, to see them attack western Libya and Tripoli, the capital, in such a way, displacing hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. It's a tragedy. It's more than frustrating.
Jonathan, I'm watching you listen. I haven't seen a lot of response, but that was a lot to hear, especially given you were U.S. envoy to Libya. What do you make of Anas's take there?
Well, first, if Erik Princes or any American was involved in arming military intervention against a government the United States recognizes, that's a violation of U.S. law. Maybe a violation of several U.S. laws. There are laws against arms brokering, in addition to being involved in supporting a foreign conflict with a country with whom the United States is not at war. So there clearly need to be, and I'm sure there will be, a federal law enforcement investigation of the allegations that have come out and whatever the UN has found. I had heard of rumors relating to Mr. Princes and other Americans in Libya, even back when I was an envoy, never able to confirm any of it. And I can tell you that in the Obama administration, if we had anything hard evidence to pin on the involvement of any American in this kind of activity, federal prosecutors would have gone after it.
Okay.
I assume the same with the Biden administration.
For the Biden administration, but what about the administration in between? Jonathan, do you fear there could have been complicity at higher levels, and are you hopeful something will be done about that if it is the case?
Well, the Department of Defense and the Department of State had a very firm view on Libya, which was that foreign intervention, foreign military activity was a bad thing. And throughout most of the Trump administration, that view was U.S. policy. Now that changed, as Anas has described, in April 2019, when Mr. Trump and apparently his national security advisor at the time, John Bolton, gave at least a yellow light to Haftar, or what was interpreted as a yellow light or a green light, in response to push, as reported, pushed by the leaders of Egypt and perhaps the Emirates. Certainly there were contacts with both countries and Donald Trump at exactly this time. So there needs to be further reporting on that, further investigation of that. The president's got a lot of freedom in the United States to direct U.S. Foreign policy, even without the Congress. The exact parameters of that depend on a lot of things. But people do not have the freedom as private individuals to go to war with a country that we recognize.
Right.
So the role of the White House still needs to be figured out in that period of time. It wasn't good in the spring of 2019. It was a problem.
Anas, do you take any comfort hearing that? I mean, there are processes in place. You're hearing this will be investigated, that there will be penalties if people broke the law, international or otherwise. Do you see accountability somewhere in the chain of command here? No. Why?
No, well, because let's not wrench this from its context. You can pick up any broadsheet now in the world, in Western Europe, in the United States, in any of the English language and including European language broadsheets, and you'll find that there has been this years now of dog whistling, trying to rile up the far right and the alt-right that have now moved in, the populists that have moved into power across Europe and into the United States over the last several years. And it's this dog whistling that characterizes anybody that does not conform to this authoritarian worldview that, Muslims in the Arab world, in the Middle East and North Africa can't do politics. If it's not the generals, then it's going to be ISIS. And that's essentially what they've been doing, characterizing anything that deems itself to be remotely democratic, remotely civilian in nature is an Islamist. And that dog whistling that has been taking place for years moves into the decision-making space where you find people like John Bolton, who then give you a wink, give you a nod, a wag on the nose. All of this stuff is just blurring the lines. And I think it's because of this kind of, this dark area, this gray area that we're operating in now, where it's so difficult to pin anything down. It kind of characterizes the mood. It characterizes the last several years of this erosion of the global order. But it also tells you a little bit more about how people like Erik Princes are able to function. The only reason that these individuals function is for deniability. The only reason why these middlemen function is so that states that know that they can't break the law use individuals like Erik Princes to break the law. They give you an arm's length of deniability, so you can just say, oh, sorry, well, if it was an American citizen, we'll prosecute him. What about the next one and the next one? The Kremlin today, for example, has been, the foreign minister, Libya's foreign minister, Mohamed Siela, met with his counterpart in Moscow a month and a half ago to ask him to remove Russian mercenaries from central Libya. They have been documented in aerial footage by AFRICOM. They have been documented by Reuters on the scene in Libya. Russia's foreign ministry just said, we don't know anything about these guys. Deniability is at the center of this, and we have to take it into its initial context, its global context. This is the erosion of the global order, and it's all taking place in Libya.
Jonathan, you feel that gray area doesn't allow for that much exploitation?
Well, it can. The mercenaries need to leave Libya. Let's be absolutely clear, they should all be gone. The foreign military should all be gone. But if Erik Princes thinks, or any American thinks, they can get away with a foreign military adventure against a country with whom the United States is at peace, a government the United States recognizes, they're wrong. There are prosecutions regularly in the United States for Americans who carry out such adventures. And if this was some kind of proxy effort by the White House, well, the State Department didn't know about it. Defense Department didn't know about it, both of whom have condemned mercenary. And I hope if there was any U.S. mercenary activity, it does get prosecuted. Certainly the Obama administration would not have tolerated it, and I am sure the Biden administration won't.
Okay, Anas, I can see you're not quite as confident in the systems that are set up to prevent such a thing, from working fully. But Jonathan, let me ask you this on the broader scale. I mean, how pervasive are private mercenary operations like this globally? Because Libya has really exposed the use of, fully established private corporations, the Wagner Group and Project Opus, for example, to perpetuate civil wars in foreign countries.
In the 80s and the 90s and the aughts, we would see people from time to time market themselves as offering mercenary services, and they would regularly wind up getting tracked down, extradited, and imprisoned. And that is what I would expect would happen with anyone who is carrying that out without a permission of a government. Now, the Wagner Group is different. The Wagner Group is clearly acting as agents of the Kremlin. I have absolutely no doubt of it. And there were Syrian mercenaries in Libya who were brought in by the government of Turkey. It's pretty clear. And all the mercenaries need to be out. The foreign military forces need to be out. Libyans need to be able to decide their own fate without what the United States is now calling, properly, toxic foreign interference. It's got to stop.
Okay, Anas, can you imagine, for example, that the connection between the Wagner Group and the Kremlin that Jonathan has just described, a very clear, direct connection, is different in the case of Erik Princes and the Trump administration, that the Trump administration, for example, wasn't as complicit in anything Erik Princes may have been doing in Libya? Or do you feel they're also one and the same, very similar to the Kremlin and the Wagner Group?
No, I think there's a difference. There is a difference there, and I think we have to be quite clear about the way in which they've operated. I mean, at an institutional level, the Wagner Group is linked to the Kremlin, but I think at a personal level, Erik Princes' ties to Donald Trump are unquestionable. And I think that's where this is more about the personal ties, the ties in between that go away from the institutions and erode the integrity of those institutions. And that's kind of really what the question is when it comes to the US's relationship with Libya over the last several years. Of course, many of us hope that those things will change, but let's not lose sight of what happened. Whilst we're still discussing these matters, this isn't the first erosion of international norms. Let's remember, $10 billion worth of counterfeit currency were delivered by Russians into eastern Libya. That's never happened before. These aren't the first mercenaries that made their way into Libya. They were also there in 2017. They've also been there in 2014. So it wasn't the first time. This is the first time that it's getting kind of global attention. But if you ignore these things and brush them under the carpet, they come back and bite you. We should remember now that this has become an alarming aspect for the US, at least for AFRICOM, because Russia has been able to establish itself in NATO's southern flank, and it's really causing a lot of fissures within the NATO coalition. So it's something that's that's bothering everyone at the geopolitical level. When you bring it back to a human level, and we shouldn't forget, we're speaking about human lives here. There are people that were found in ovens, burnt alive in Tarhuna, in the town of Tarhuna, only 70, 80 kilometers away from Tripoli. That's what this global disorder, and that's what the erosion of international norms looks like. So we shouldn't forget that when it's human lives at cost, it shouldn't have to be a geopolitical tinkering and a chess game. These are human lives that have been lost, and I'm not drawing away from that. That's the footnote when it comes to these matters. The footnote for me is, whether it's Erik Princes or whether it's Wagner, the chapter heading is that human lives were lost and they could have been avoided. Okay. Because what I'm absolutely certain of is everybody knew. Remember that Haftar didn't launch his offensive outside of, it wasn't just Libyans that were there. French special forces were in western Libya in the town of Gharian. They discovered US anti-tank missiles that were left there. The State Department conducted an investigation, found out that there were French special forces that were there. There have been timeless and numerous countries that are involved in this. How much did they know? And that UN panel of expert reports, that's a black box. Once we find out the full details there and the investigation moves forward, we'll know that what we're hearing today in the next few days is the tip of the iceberg. There's much more in this.
Anas, I'm going to have to let that be the last word. So unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment. I'd really have loved to speak to both of you further. But thank you both so much, Jonathan Weiner and Anas Al-Gomati, for joining us. Now to a war being waged in cyberspace. Social media giant Facebook unfriends, then refriends the nation of Australia over a spat that's redefining the relationship between big tech and big government. In a snap decision last week, Facebook blocked all Australian news providers after the government proposed legislation that would force the platform to pay for local news content. The move was met with outrage, especially since it also cut access to some emergency and fire services, as well as certain state health organizations. Now, both sides eventually came to an agreement, but who wins and who will have to compromise? Well, that's what I put to our panelists, Russell Skelton, director of the RMIT ABC Fact Check and senior lecturer in communications at Western Sydney University, Tanya Notley.
Facebook have agreed that they're now in a process of renegotiating with news media providers. I think users are the ones that are left really uncertain of how things will go. Facebook have said that they still retain the ability to, again, cut news if they are forced into agreements that they're not happy with. So, I think it's a little bit uncertain for users, and I think there's very mixed reactions in Australia to this. Some people are really happy that there's no news on Facebook anymore, but many others, of course, are being adversely affected. And we're yet to really understand the full impact of 1 week without news on Facebook.
Okay, Russell, was this all really necessary? I mean, did the model need to change?
Look, I just think it was all a bit of a negotiation, really. I don't think nothing has really changed all that much, and we don't know the details of the deal. I think it was a pretty heavy-handed exercise by Facebook to show who's boss, and I think it resonated pretty clearly with the government, because the government said they would not do any amendments to their legislation, and now they're prepared to consider amendments. So I'm not sure who's the winner or loser here. Yeah,
that is unclear. And Russell, I mean, I know you had concerns initially that this blockage could actually facilitate the spread of misinformation. Some were saying the spread of fake news, if you prefer that term. Do you still have those concerns?
Well, I do. It depends. I mean, I've been speaking to Facebook. I'm director of RMIT ABC Fact Check, and I've been talking to Facebook in Singapore, and they've assured me we're going to go back online, but we've been dark for a number of days now, and nobody can see our posts. It's not the end of the world for us, because we are broadcast on ABC platforms as well. But when we want to reach a diverse audience, particularly around when we're debunking false news, particularly around COVID, we don't have that diversity of audience anymore. We're very much limited to the ABC audience, which is considerable.
And now going forward, how difficult will this be to monitor the revenue streams, who's getting paid for what, when links are shared, for example, will there also be compensation? How will they monitor this process?
Well, unfortunately, in my opinion, what's happened is there's going to be deals done with individual news companies. We know that Google has made deals. We're told it's probably in around $150 million a year. The estimates we're hearing is that Facebook will be paying about $50 million a year to news media organizations, but none of that will be made public or transparent, and it won't be per click, or, you know, it'll be a model of negotiating directly with news media organizations, and those who are the most influential and powerful are likely to get the most money. So what we don't have a guarantee of is that this estimated $200 million is going to go directly and fully into journalism and public interest journalism. You know, it may go to these companies and it doesn't get filtered down sufficiently to journalism, because we've seen huge cuts in Australia, massive cuts over years. And so, you know, there's no doubt that journalism is in a near crisis in Australia. And it'd be great if these funds can address this issue, and that we can see funds coming from Google and Facebook who do obviously benefit from public interest journalism.
Certainly. Russell, do you share those concerns?
I do, and I think what's very troubling about all of this is now Facebook can bypass the government's code and just do a deal, say, with News Limited directly. We probably will never know how much money they're going to receive, or we may or may not. And there's a whole lot of more minor players here, you know, regional newspapers and small outlets, and it's not clear whether they will even benefit at all from this. You know, if we look at our regional newspaper network, they're saying they're not entirely clear whether they'll even get $1 out of this. So it's a very uncertain situation. It's very unclear.
Right. Yeah, there are also freelancers as well in the picture that, you know, they live job to job. So if they have to pay, if Facebook and Google have to pay the content providers, that's, as Tanya was alluding to, that's not really going to trickle down to where it matters. But let me ask you as well, when we saw Facebook react the way it did, Russell, and respond so quickly by shutting it all down, could that potentially backfire on Facebook with people realizing that maybe they shouldn't allow their businesses to be so dependent on a free but privately owned platform?
Look, I think it did backfire here as a public relations exercise, but they've got what they wanted. So we had a few days without news appearing on Facebook, but they forced the government to the negotiating table. They've got the government to amend its legislation, which it said it would never do. The deals are going to be in secret. I would say Facebook's done pretty well out of this, and is quite happy to wear the odium that goes with this sort of high-handed action they took. Where I took real issue with them was that Facebook were talking to us about joining their news fact-checking initiative. They were going to pay us to fact-check content, as they do with a whole lot of fact-checkers around the world, and they still shut us down. Even though they want our content, they still shut us down. So it's a pretty ruthless business here.
Tanya, one final issue for you to touch on. Are you expecting other governments around the world now to follow suit with this style of legislation? It's already started.
100%. Why wouldn't they? You know, a couple of $100 million to news media organizations. News media organizations are struggling around the world, so why wouldn't they?
Right. We have another minute. Russell, let me get your take on that. I see you had some comments.
Oh, no, I was just noting the fact that in Britain, they were sort of watching it very closely, but the official government spokesman said they weren't going to use what Australia did as a model to follow.
That they were not going to use that. I mean, this, again, we're back to where there's so much uncertainty as to how this could play out. Tanya, I'll finish with you. Give me kind of your worst case scenario. I hate to sound so cynical, but what could really go wrong with these models?
Look, to be honest, the focus of my research is young people in news, and I get really concerned that in the end, Facebook decide it's not such a bad thing to cut news out of Facebook, and this follows suit in other social media platforms. And we know that, although in Australia only 6% of people say that they only get their news from Facebook, adults say, we know that young people increasingly get news from social media. And I think that the way that we engage with news on social media, it's really important. We're hearing from our own personal networks that this story is important to them. We're getting other context around that news. And I think it would be really unfortunate and really sad if, we see more of these kinds of actions, which in the end are restricting people's choice and people's freedom. And that's my main concern.
Russell, quick final words.
Well, I totally endorse those comments. I think the issue here is that trusted news won't, in the worst case scenario, was not appearing on Facebook. So therefore, all the fake news, all the debunking, the malicious posts, all the rest of it thrived during this period. And that's a terrible negative, I think, and a terrible service that Facebook did Australia during that period.
Okay, indeed. Russell, Skelton, Tanya Notley, thank you so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. We appreciate having you. And thank you so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. I'm Andrea Sankey. See you next time.